Come see us on tour in Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Co-Host, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Toledo, Ohio, and Toronto, Ontario. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. We have a special guest with us today, Sharyl Attkisson, 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and author. She was formerly an investigative correspondent in the Washington Bureau for CBS News and a substitute anchor for the CBS Evening News. She currently hosts and manages the investigative news program Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson on Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which focuses on accountability and investigative reporting. Attkisson has authored several books, including Stonewalled, The Smear, and her recent book, Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. Welcome to the show, Sharyl Attkisson.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Jimmy.
Well, it's great to have you. Now, you came to my attention because on Twitter, I came across this video that you did. I think this was in 2006.
Yeah.
And let me just remind people the kind of bombshell report you did about the flu vaccine. And let's listen.
Here's what scientists have found. Over 20 years, the percentage of seniors getting flu shots increased sharply from 15% to 65%. It stands to reason that flu deaths among the elderly should have taken a dramatic dip, making an X graph like this. Instead, flu deaths among the elderly continue to climb. It was hard to believe, so researchers at the National Institutes of Health set out to do a study adjusting for all kinds of factors that could be masking the true benefits of the shots. But no matter how they crunched the numbers, they got the same disappointing result. Flu shots have not reduced deaths among the elderly. It's not what health officials hope to find. NIH wouldn't let us interview the study's lead author.
So we showed this before on the show. Everybody should go watch that video. It's amazing. You did, first of all, you did that 20 years ago. You look exactly the same. I don't know how you pulled that off.
I don't know about that.
Was that the help of Big Pharma? I don't know. We'll see. But your latest book, Follow the Sun. First of all, was there any fallout from you doing that report? Because that was really, I haven't seen a report like that on national news or any kind of corporate news since. So how did that come about, and how were you allowed to do that?
Well, I was assigned to cover stories about vaccines in the pharmaceutical industry in the early 2000s. People may not remember, we were all doing it, not just CBS News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, all the networks. These were big stories, and a lot was being uncovered. There were congressional hearings, but something changed. I'd say 2006 time period, we were starting to see that change in the relationship between Big Pharma and media companies and what they wanted from us, meaning the bosses at the corporate levels. So you saw that report on the flu shots before what I would call the clampdown on those kinds of stories, when they were still being invited and well received, at least by my bosses at CBS. So I was covering a lot of these issues, shocked at what I was learning, because I'm not a health reporter. I was assigned to sort of cover the return of the smallpox vaccine program after 9/11, which was halted after myocarditis and deaths from that vaccine. I started to learn so much and realized that I could do stories every week the rest of my life on these scandals. But so many of them were just unbelievable to me. And I spent years working on some of them before I ever published my first story, because it just sounds crazy at first until you start to understand how things work. And it's not how I ever thought they did. You know, I always relied on mainstream medicine and the government and our public health agencies, and was shocked as anybody to learn these things. And I thought that was very important to bring these types of stories to light on the news.
And so tell me about, so you didn't get any backlash so people were doing those kind of reports. In fact, I kind of remember Jon Stewart and brought on RFK Jr. in the early 2000s to talk about his research on vaccines, and he thanked him for his work. Joe Scarborough had RFK Jr. on, and he commiserated, said that his son was injured by a vaccine, and then all of a sudden it just all went away. So what happened?
Well, I learned only with the benefit of hindsight that at the time we were starting to feel pushback over these sorts of stories, the pharmaceutical industry was making new partnerships with media organizations, including CBS News at the corporate level. And together, Pharma and these media corporations were lobbying as partners on Congress to loosen up the rules to allow more pharmaceutical advertising on TV and other media. People may not know if they're not old enough. This was forbidden against the law until what I think is relatively recent history, and it's forbidden in most other countries to advertise prescription drugs. But that meant billions and billions and over time trillions of dollars for the media companies with this partnership. And as that partnership was being forged at the corporate level, we were starting to feel the effects of it in the news division at CBS, and I'm sure that happened at the other media outlets as well.
And so when you refer to it as a partnership, what do you mean by a partnership?
Well, I was told specifically that lobbyists from the corporation at CBS went together with pharmaceutical industry lobbyists on Capitol Hill to lobby members of Congress to make sure that there was more advertising allowed on the network. So literally a partnership to try to financially benefit both sides of the equation, but I would argue maybe at the expense of public health.
So that's quite a partnership. So it just sounds like corruption, right?
Listen, I have my own thoughts over time about whether those types of partnerships should be allowed ethically and how they could be firewalled, at least from the news divisions, but they are not. I expect that these pharmaceutical companies would want to increase their bottom line the best they can. I am not shocked, especially with what I know now, that they might hide or cover up the things that they've done that, about side effects from drugs and dangers and harms has been well documented because they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders or whoever they're reporting to make money. But we in the media were supposed to be, at least I thought, sort of firewalled for that so we could at least provide some independent oversight, particularly when Congress also fails to do so because both parties, Republicans and Democrats, get so much of their money from the pharmaceutical industry now.
So what I often say is that, when a news agency gets money from an advertiser, in theory, it's to take that money that provides the resources so they can do investigations. And what they're really doing is bribing the news companies. So they're funding their non-investigation, correct?
Yeah. It not only influences theoretically the advertising they get on the network, but we have seen that it largely influences the stories that don't get done. So it wasn't just that, and I certainly don't object to the pharmaceutical industry wanting their side of the story heard in a controversy, of course, in a story. But it came to be, and this is commonplace now, it just wasn't back then around the 2006 time period, where they didn't want stories to air at all. And some, managers who I think were conflicted at the networks and other media organizations also were starting to censor stories that had not been done on such a large scale before. So I knew something was wrong and something was different when they weren't just arguing, be sure to tell both sides of this argument. They were just saying, we can't tell this story at all. The people must not know about it.
And are you surprised that news media organizations and journalists ubiquitously just accepted this new paradigm?
Yes, and I will tell you that there were a lot of reporters who were like me, who were covering these issues, good reporters at other news outlets who had similar experiences as I did, but maybe just didn't have the wherewithal to ultimately launch successful challenges. Honestly, I gave up too, to some degree. Once they didn't want the pharmaceutical stories. Gosh, there are thousands of things for me to investigate. I tried to look at other things, that I could investigate and publish some online, because you can get things published online at CBS, for example, easier than what you could get on the broadcast network. So I tried to continue to pitch and do those stories as best I could, but look at other things. So we as reporters understood that to get on the air in a very competitive environment, you do the stories the bosses want. You don't do the stories they don't want that they're never going to then publish. So it just sort of becomes, the lay of the land after we understand what they do and don't want.
So you talk about your accidental enlightenment. Tell people about that.
I was, I think, like a lot of people, particularly probably how they were before COVID, where I thought health and medicine were really one of the last trusted institutions. I've been an investigative reporter for many years and maybe didn't put a lot of faith in government and the way things work at federal agencies and so on, because I'd seen so many instances of waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption. But I really didn't think about that applying to the health agencies because I kind of saw that as a pure thing, science, and it's pure and doctors having our best interest at heart. But after 9/11, I was assigned by CBS to cover the restart of the smallpox vaccine program. And that would be because maybe terrorists would now, the thought was, use smallpox as a biological weapon. So maybe we should start revaccinating everybody. And what I learned was, just basic things surprised me, that the reason we don't all get smallpox vaccine right now, even if that could be a threat of a bioweapon coming our way, that vaccine is more problematic than others in terms of acknowledged side effects. So to start the program up again as they were going to do and give it to so many civilians and first responders and military was a big deal. And a lot of experts were cautioning against it, public health experts, and were watching it very carefully. Long story short, after a fairly short period of time, not only did the first responders not want to take these shots, they were offered it first, but those in the military who were forced to take them, there started to be adverse events. There were some deaths, and I've learned that even a couple of deaths that may not sound like a lot signal or imply many more have occurred that may not be attributed to the cause. So it's important, even if there's just a handful of adverse events and deaths, because it implies many more the way the system works. And one of those deaths, Jimmy, I don't know if you remember David Bloom, an NBC reporter who had embedded with the military, died of a blood clot. And I knew he had had the smallpox vaccine, and I had read that blood clots and so on had been reported to be side effects from that vaccine and others that he got to embed with the military. And it was not properly reported as a potential vaccine death, which was required under the monitoring system. And I broke that news that, it looked to me like a cover-up that they didn't want, meaning either the military or civilian complex certainly didn't want to admit there was a potential vaccine link to the death of a news correspondent that had embedded with the military. As a result of my reporting, it was reported to the proper database, David Bloom's death, as a possible vaccine adverse event. They stopped the smallpox vaccine program ultimately because of the side effects and problems. And that was just sort of my introduction into learning all these things I never even thought to question about, vaccines and medical science and what the establishment might do.
So what's interesting about this particular vaccine to me is that during COVID, at the beginning when people were vaccine hesitant, I saw many memes on social media showing a person with smallpox and attributing it all to the vaccine. And then I also did a little research. The Midwestern doctor wrote a Substack on it, and it turns out that there was a lot of controversy over the smallpox vaccine, even 100 years ago, and that towns and large groups of people were protesting against the mandatory use of the smallpox vaccine. And so did you notice that too during COVID, that people were referring to smallpox and that was like,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Smallpox, and another example that's a go-to is the polio vaccine. I will mention that my daughter's had all her vaccines. I didn't know about any of this, and I'm not saying I would make some different decisions. I wouldn't just probably across the board not vaccinate her, but she's had all her vaccinations. But one thing I discovered as they talk about the polio vaccine, most people don't know, all of the last cases of polio in this country were caused by the vaccine. They were vaccine strain polio. And I learned that from the head of vaccine court when I was covering, vaccine injury cases. And what makes me mad about that, Jimmy, is when my daughter got her shot for polio, she was offered, she didn't get the shot, she got the oral, which they called sugar water.
Yeah.
So we went to the doctor and they say, would you like to give her sugar water or a shot? And as a parent, you say sugar water, like, why is that a choice? They should have said to me, and all parents, I think, should have been told, the sugar water, as they call it, has a slight risk of giving your child polio. The injectable version had no risk of that, but they were giving and offering the sugar water version, the oral polio vaccine, to millions of kids without telling us and letting us make an informed choice. I was so angry about that. And I thought, this is just one of the thousands of things I learned about the whole program and how the government represents things and what's really going on.
So the oral polio vaccine, it uses a different type of concoction, put it that way, and Yes, it can give. In fact, we don't give the oral polio vaccine to people in the United States anymore. But guess what? They still export it and they give it to people around the world, including Africa, correct?
Yes. Shortly after my daughter had the oral polio vaccine, it was quietly pulled off the market. Now, why wouldn't that make international headlines? You know, if news were neutral, that you would want to know that they're pulling off the market the vaccine they've been offering and giving kids for years that was causing the only cases of polio left in this country, that they quietly pulled it off the market for that reason and, you know, switched strictly to the injectable version in the United States.
Now, did you notice during COVID, to get people to take the vaccine, they were touting the fact that polio had shown up again in wastewater in New York. What they didn't tout was that it was then determined that that polio they found in the wastewater came from the vaccine.
That's right. Good catch, Jimmy. You know, there's always a story behind the story, particularly when the government seems to be wanting to promote, unfortunately, a concern or maybe even provoke a scare. I've learned there's typically some kind of interest behind it if you follow the money. And yes, you're right. That was believed to have, if I remember correctly, believed to have come from someone who had either a foreigner or someone who had traveled in a foreign country, but had brought into the United States a vaccine strain case of polio that was spreading. But that was not made clear in most of the news coverage of it. It was just, oh, polio's an outbreak again. And there's always this implied blame on people who have not gotten vaccinated. And that's always used to get, you know, more people vaccinated, even when sometimes the vaccines may be part of the issue.
Come see us on tour in Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohost, New York, Providence, Rhode Island, Los Angeles, Bakersfield, San Jose, Toledo, Ohio, and Toronto, Ontario. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.